stop for a moment. Not because of breaking news, not because markets are crashing, but because something far more important is happening quietly, without headlines, without panic, and without public attention. For decades, U.S. sanctions were considered one of the most powerful financial tools in the world. When Washington pulled the lever, economies moved, trade stopped, pressure worked. But that assumption is no longer safe, because right now one of the most heavily sanctioned countries on Earth is still trading, still settling payments, and still functioning inside the global system. Not because sanctions disappeared, but because the system itself has changed. This is not a prediction. This is an explanation of how financial power actually erodes, and why Iran may be the signal, not the exception. For more than 4 decades, U.S. sanctions on Iran were treated as one of the most powerful financial weapons in modern history. Entire governments believed that if Washington pulled the right levers, access to dollars would disappear, trade would collapse, inflation would surge, and political pressure would inevitably follow. And for a long time, that belief was justified. Iran was cut off from major banking networks. Its oil exports were restricted. Foreign companies withdrew. The currency collapsed multiple times. Sanctions didn't just hurt Iran's economy, they reshaped it. But something has changed, quietly, gradually, and most people missed it. Because while headlines still describe Iran as isolated, financial data tells a different story. Oil continues to move. Trade continues to settle. Capital still flows, just not where the public expects to see it. And that raises a critical question that policymakers rarely ask out loud anymore. Why are U.S. sanctions on Iran losing financial power? To answer that, we need to understand what sanctions were actually designed to do, how they worked when they were strongest, and why the global system that made them effective is no longer as centralized as it once was. Sanctions are not about punishment, they are about control, financial control. The ability to deny access to settlement systems, reserve currencies, insurance markets, shipping, clearing banks, and ultimately trust. For decades, the U.S. didn't need to enforce sanctions everywhere. It only needed to enforce them at the center of the system. That center was the dollar. By the early 2000s, nearly all global energy trade was settled in dollars. Most international banks required dollar clearing access. The SWIFT messaging system ran through jurisdictions aligned with Washington. Insurance for tankers was underwritten by firms operating in Western legal frameworks. If the U.S. Treasury said no, transactions didn't just slow down, they stopped. This is why sanctions on Iran once worked with brutal efficiency. Iranian oil couldn't be sold easily, payments couldn't be cleared. Even countries that wanted to buy Iranian crude struggled to pay without risking secondary sanctions. Iran wasn't just sanctioned by the U.S., it was sanctioned by the structure of global finance itself. But structures evolve. After 2012, when U.S. and EU sanctions intensified, Iran faced a choice: accept permanent dependency on Western-controlled systems, or redesign how it interacted with global trade altogether. That redesign didn't happen overnight, it didn't happen publicly. And it didn't rely on defiance, it relied on adaptation. The first shift was transactional, not ideological. Iran began prioritizing trade mechanisms that reduced visibility rather than confrontation. Instead of demanding access to blocked systems, it started using alternatives that existed on the margins: barter arrangements, currency swaps, indirect settlement through third-party financial hubs. None of these replaced the dollar overnight, but they reduced dependence on it. At the same time, the global environment was changing in ways that unintentionally benefited sanctioned states. China's energy demand continued to grow. Russia faced its own sanctions and began building parallel settlement infrastructure. Regional trade blocs expanded. More importantly, non-Western economies started asking a question that would have been unthinkable 20 years earlier. What if dollar dependence itself is the risk? This question didn't emerge because of Iran. It emerged because sanctions were no longer rare. They became routine. Venezuela, Russia, Afghanistan, parts of Africa, assets frozen, accounts blocked, reserves seized. What was once considered an exceptional tool started to look like a permanent feature of the system. And when a system applies pressure too broadly, participants start planning exits, even if they never announce them. For Iran, this shift created space. Not freedom, but flexibility. Oil exports are the clearest example. Official numbers often understate Iranian exports because they measure compliance, not reality. Tanker tracking data, customs discrepancies, and import records from destination countries consistently suggest that Iranian crude continues to reach markets, particularly in Asia. The volumes fluctuate, but the channels remain open. How? Not through defiance, but through fragmentation. Ship-to-ship transfers, reflagged vessels, blended crude grades, indirect routing. None of these methods are new. What's new is scale and tolerance. Enforcement becomes exponentially harder when trade routes multiply and transactions are broken into smaller, less visible components. Sanctions rely on choke points. Fragmentation removes choke points. Financial settlement followed the same logic. Instead of clearing payments directly through sanctioned banks, transactions increasingly route through regional intermediaries, smaller institutions, and currency conversion layers that reduce traceability. Payments may not settle in dollars at all. They may pass through yuan, dirhams, rubles, or local currency arrangements before being converted later. This does not mean sanctions are irrelevant. They still raise costs. They still reduce efficiency. But raising costs is not the same as stopping activity. And over time, markets adapt to cost increases if alternatives remain viable. Another factor, weakening sanctions, is enforcement fatigue. Sanctions are only as powerful as the willingness to enforce them consistently. Over time, enforcement becomes politically expensive. It strains alliances. It disrupts energy markets. It raises prices domestically. Each enforcement decision now carries trade-offs that didn't exist when the U.S. held near total financial dominance. This creates selective pressure. Some violations are pursued aggressively, others are quietly ignored. Markets notice the difference. Iran noticed it too. By the late 2010s, Iran's strategy shifted from survival to optimization. Not expansion, not confrontation, but resilience. The goal was no longer to break sanctions. It was to make them less decisive. And that's the key distinction. Sanctions lose power not when they fail completely, but when they stop determining outcomes. Today, Iran's economy still faces constraints. Inflation remains high. Investment is limited. Growth is uneven. But collapse is no longer automatic, and that alone represents a strategic shift. Meanwhile, the global financial system continues to fragment. More trade settles outside the dollar. More countries build redundancy into payment systems. More institutions question concentration risk. None of this is coordinated. None of it is ideological. It's defensive. And every defensive adjustment reduces the leverage sanctions once held. This doesn't mean the U.S. has lost financial power. It means that power is no longer exclusive. And exclusivity was the multiplier that made sanctions devastating. Without it, sanctions become friction instead of force. In the next part, we need to examine the most important question of all. Not whether Iran has escaped sanctions, but whether the sanctions model itself is reaching its structural limits. Because Iran may not be the exception. It may be the early signal. To understand the structural limits of sanctions, we need to separate how sanctions are supposed to work from how they actually work in a complex, decentralized global economy. On paper, sanctions function like a switch, access on, access off. But in reality, global finance does not behave like a switch. It behaves like a network. And networks respond to pressure by rerouting, not by shutting down. In the early stages of U.S. financial dominance, the network had a clear center: dollar clearing. Western correspondent banks, insurance markets, shipping registries. If pressure was applied at the center, the entire system felt it. That is why sanctions once appeared clean and decisive. But the moment sanctions became permanent rather than exceptional, the network began evolving around them. Every company, bank, or country exposed to the system started asking a simple risk question. What happens if access disappears overnight? Not because of wrongdoing, but because of geopolitics. That question changed behavior long before it changed headlines. Redundancy became rational, diversification became necessary, and neutrality became valuable. This is where the structural limit begins. Sanctions depend on concentration. The more concentrated global finance is, the more powerful sanctions become. The more fragmented it becomes, the less decisive sanctions are. Not ineffective, less decisive. Iran did not weaken sanctions alone. The system weakened them collectively. After 2018, when the U.S. withdrew from the nuclear agreement and reimposed sanctions, the expectation in Washington was that economic pressure would force rapid political concessions. Instead, something else happened. European firms initially complied, but resentment grew. Asian buyers adapted. Regional trade channels adjusted, and enforcement became inconsistent. Not because of sympathy for Iran, but because of competing priorities: energy security, inflation, supply chain stability, strategic competition with China. Sanctions enforcement started colliding with other objectives. And when objectives conflict, enforcement always becomes selective. This selectivity sends a signal to markets. Markets are not moral actors. They are adaptive systems. If a rule is enforced sometimes, but not always, it becomes a risk calculation rather than a barrier. Once something becomes a calculation, capital finds ways to price it in. This is exactly what happened with Iranian oil. Instead of disappearing from markets, Iranian crude began trading at a discount. That discount absorbed sanction risk. Buyers willing to accept complexity and opacity gained cheaper supply. Sellers accepted lower margins in exchange for continuity. Sanctions became embedded into pricing rather than eliminating trade entirely. That is a structural failure from a control perspective. Another limit is scale. Modern global trade is simply too large to police perfectly. Millions of transactions move daily across jurisdictions with different incentives, regulatory capacities, and political alignments. Enforcement relies on cooperation. cooperation relies on alignment. Alignment is no longer universal. As global power becomes multipolar, enforcement becomes negotiable. Iran benefits from this environment not because it is powerful, but because it is persistent. It does not need dominance. It needs tolerance. And tolerance is easier to secure in a fragmented system. There is also a time factor that sanctions rarely account for. Sanctions assume that pressure accumulates faster than adaptation. That was once true. It is no longer guaranteed. Adaptation is now faster. Financial engineering evolves. Trade finance instruments become more complex. Digital tracking improves enforcement, but it also pushes transactions further into informal or semi-formal channels that are harder to monitor. Every enforcement upgrade triggers an avoidance upgrade. This is not unique to Iran. It is systemic. Another structural issue is credibility. Sanctions derive power from belief. Belief that access will not return. Belief that compliance matters. Belief that alignment is rewarded. When sanctions are lifted, reimposed, waived, tightened, relaxed, and selectively enforced over time, belief erodes. Iran has experienced every version of sanctions. Maximum pressure, negotiated relief, reimposition, partial enforcement, waivers, informal tolerance. Each phase teaches actors how reversible pressure can be. That lesson spreads. Countries watching Iran do not need sanctions lifted to learn from them. They only need to see survival. And survival, in sanction logic, is failure. Not moral failure, strategic failure. Because the goal of sanctions is not discomfort, it is outcome control. And control weakens when the target learns to operate within constraints rather than collapse under them. There is also an internal contradiction in modern sanctions policy. The same system that enforces sanctions also depends on global participation to function efficiently. Excessive pressure reduces participation reduces control. This creates a feedback loop. The more sanctions are used, the more incentives exist to reduce exposure to the system enforcing them. That reduction does not happen dramatically. It happens quietly, incrementally. Through reserve diversification, none of these need to replace the dollar. They only need to reduce dependency. Iran exists inside that reduction. Another factor often overlooked is institutional learning inside sanctioned states. Early sanctions punish existing structures. Over time, those structures either collapse or adapt. New intermediaries emerge. New elites benefit. New channels form. These actors become stakeholders in sanctions resilience. Once that happens, sanctions stop targeting a static system. They target a moving one. Iran today does not operate the same financial system it did 20 years ago. Its trade networks, payment routes, and risk tolerances have evolved under pressure. That evolution cannot be reversed simply by increasing pressure. Pressure now reinforces adaptation. This is why escalation often produces diminishing returns. Meanwhile, the US faces a dilemma. Sanctions remain politically attractive. They signal resolve without military engagement. They are visible. They are measurable. They create the appearance of control. Removing them is politically risky. Maintaining them is institutionally easy. But effectiveness is harder to measure. When sanctions no longer change behavior but remain in place, they become symbolic. And symbolic tools lose coercive value over time. This does not mean sanctions will disappear. It means their role will change. They will become one factor among many, rather than the deciding one. Iran's case illustrates this shift clearly, not because Iran has won, but because sanctions no longer define its economic destiny. They shape it, they constrain it, but they do not dictate outcomes. And that distinction matters, because once sanctions lose decisiveness in one high-profile case, the precedent spreads. Other states learn. Other systems adapt. The tool does not break, it dulls. In the final part, we need to confront the most uncomfortable implication of all. Not what this means for Iran, but what it means for the future of financial power itself. Because when sanctions lose leverage, it's not just targets that change. The system that relied on them changes too. The implications for future financial power are far larger than any single country, and far more uncomfortable than most policymakers are willing to admit. Because if sanctions are losing leverage, the question is not whether the United States is becoming weaker, but whether the nature of power itself is changing. For decades, financial power was centralized. It flowed through a small number of institutions, currencies, and legal frameworks. Control was possible because participation was unavoidable. If you wanted access to global trade, capital markets, or energy flows, you had to pass through the same narrow corridors. That is what made coercion efficient. But efficiency depends on monopoly. And monopolies rarely disappear overnight. They erode. What we are witnessing now is not the collapse of U.S. financial power, but the erosion of its exclusivity. The dollar still dominates global reserves. U.S. capital markets remain the deepest and most liquid. Sanctions still matter, but they no longer operate in a vacuum. They operate in a crowded, adaptive, partially resistant environment. Iran exists within that environment, not as a victor, not as a model, but as a stress test. Iran demonstrates what happens when a state is cut off long enough to be forced into permanent adaptation. The result is not prosperity, it is resilience. And resilience is enough to weaken coercive tools. This creates a paradox for financial power. The more it is used as a weapon, the more incentives exist to build armor against it. That armor does not need to be perfect. It only needs to reduce vulnerability below a critical threshold. Once that threshold is crossed, pressure no longer guarantees compliance. The US now faces a choice it rarely had to confront before. It can continue to rely on sanctions as a primary tool, accepting diminishing returns and increasing system fragmentation. Or it can adapt its own strategy to a world where financial power is shared, negotiated, and constrained by interdependence. Neither option is simple. Reducing sanctions risks appearing weak. Escalating sanctions risks accelerating fragmentation. Maintaining sanctions risks institutional inertia without strategic payoff. Iran sits at the center of this dilemma because it exposes all three paths simultaneously. Sanctions did not collapse Iran. Engagement did not normalize it. Pressure did not resolve underlying political conflicts. What changed instead was the environment around those tools. And that environment is shaped by trends far larger than Iran. Multipolar trade, regional settlement systems, reserve diversification, energy market rebalancing, technology-driven financial routing. None of these were designed to undermine sanctions, but together they do. Financial power is no longer about denying access entirely. It is about shaping incentives, managing dependencies, and maintaining credibility. Sanctions that are perceived as permanent, inconsistent, or politically driven weaken credibility rather than strengthen it. Credibility is the hidden currency of financial power. Once lost, it is difficult to restore. Iran's experience sends a signal not because it defied sanctions, but because it survived them without capitulation. Survival changes expectations. Expectations shape behavior. Behavior reshapes systems. This is how power diffuses, not through confrontation, through adaptation. And the most important lesson is this: sanctions are most powerful when they are rarely used, universally supported, and clearly tied to achievable outcomes. When they become routine, unilateral, and indefinite, they transform from leverage into friction. Friction slows systems. It does not control them. The future of financial power will belong not to those who can block access most aggressively, but to those who can design systems others willingly choose to participate in. Power will shift from coercion to coordination, from enforcement to alignment, from dominance to influence. That transition is already underway. Iran is not the cause, it is the signal. And signals in history matter far more than outcomes, because by the time outcomes are visible, the system has already changed.